In 1999, a bride named Emily Larson vanished during her own wedding reception. No screams, no witnesses, no exit recorded on camera. The ballroom lights glowed soft pink. The champagne was still cold. The cake sat untouched. A single high heel was found near the kitchen door. No scuff marks, no sign of a fall. The DJ kept playing. Guests assumed she had gotten overwhelmed. Cold feet, panic, the usual whispered excuses. Her new husband looked confused, then concerned, then quiet. By midnight, the party thinned. Someone boxed the cake. Someone took the flowers home. The police were called, but it was too late. The trail had already cooled. There was no sign of forced entry, no blood, no phone call, just absence. And absence doesn't leave fingerprints. Emily's disappearance became a myth wrapped in lace. The girl who ran from her own wedding, a small-town tragedy swallowed by time. Her dress was never found. Her body never recovered. Her bank account never touched. For years, it stayed that way. A closed case filed under the quiet category of unresolved. Until 2024, when a thrift store in Vermont received a vintage couch as part of a furniture donation from an estate sale. Floral print, mid-century frame, somewhere, but intact. A tag on the bottom said made in 1998. The couch sat in the back room for weeks. Then a staffer noticed the armrest was loose. During reupholstery, a strange fabric was uncovered beneath the floral pattern. White silk, delicate, too fine for factory lining. Someone had sewn it in by hand. A jagged, clumsy stitch pattern looped beneath the structure. Inside the lining, they found something else. A photo. A faded Polaroid. It showed Emily Larson sitting on the same couch, still in her wedding dress, smiling. But the background betrayed the image. In the mirror behind her, a second figure stood, barely visible, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. The date on the photo matched the wedding night. The couch was tagged as coming from the home of a retired carpenter named Walter Marin. He had died earlier that year. No known relatives, no criminal record. Just a man who kept to himself and left behind a house filled with antique furniture. But the couch wasn't listed in any catalog of his work. It wasn't even his style. And that raised questions. The thrift store alerted police. The couch was taken in as evidence. Forensic analysis confirmed the silk matched photos of Emily's wedding dress. DNA lifted from the inner stitching revealed hair and skin cells, consistent with her profile. A deeper scan of the wooden frame found dried blood deep inside the inner corner, nearly invisible to the eye, too small to pool, too old to drip, but present. Someone had bled inside the couch, someone had stitched the silk there to hide it, and someone had placed the photo like a gravestone without earth. The investigation reopened. Emily's name moved from cold file to active case. Neighbors of Walter Marin were questioned. Most described him as quiet, polite, helpful, if a little distant. He had done repair work for years, reupholstered couches, built custom cabinets, installed doors. He had once worked as a contracted hand for events around town, including, investigators learned, the hotel where Emily's wedding was held. Payroll logs confirmed it. He had been hired weeks before the wedding to refinish banquet chairs and stayed on through the night of the event. He had access to the service corridors, to the loading dock, to the kitchens, and no one had ever thought to look at him twice. He signed out just before midnight. No camera showed him leaving, but he had a badge, and badge doors don't track faces. They track access. He had the means. The timing, the silence. But what he didn't have was a motive. No known connection to Emily, no known history of violence, no clear trigger, until they searched his house. Inside a back room, behind a false wall, they found ledgers, dozens of them, not financial, not work logs, not journals, records, lists of items brought in, dates, initials, descriptions of fabric, of lining, of things stored inside furniture, names never written in full, just fragments. But one entry stood out, 6.1999, white silk, brass button, photo enclosed, initials, EL, listed beneath it, the words, forgiveness sewn. Nothing else. No location. No explanation. Just that. And then below that, a second line, scrawled smaller. They don't make noise once they're stitched. The handwriting shook, the words uneven, like someone trying to finish something before the memory slipped, or the guilt took over. The case grew darker. Not just a disappearance, not just a couch, not just a girl who ran. A disappearance rewritten into furniture, a silence stitched shut. And now, 25 years later, the thread had come loose. They reopened the wedding venue records from 1999, digging through paper logs and handwritten staff notes faded from time and heat. The hotel had changed names twice since then, but the archive room remained untouched, a storage closet that still smelled like dust and old printer ink. The security tapes were long gone, but the maintenance requests weren't. 5 days before the wedding, a service note was filed for ballroom exit, door 3. Faulty lock wouldn't seal from the outside. The request was marked urgent, resolved within 24 hours by Walter Marin. He had access then, not just to the chairs or the furniture, but to the exits. He would have known which door stuck, which hallway cameras didn't reach, which loading dock remained open after hours while vendors loaded out. A man with no enemies, no record, and no reason to be remembered. A man who fixed things, who was paid in cash and faded into the background. The photo inside the couch confirmed he wasn't just at the venue. He was near her, close enough to be reflected, and no one noticed. Not the groom, not the family, not the dozens of guests who all swore she'd run away. The search expanded. Every piece of furniture in Walter's estate was re-examined. 6 couches, 4 armchairs, 2 benches, all traced back to clients who had died, relocated, or left no forwarding address. Each one had a hidden panel. Inside one, they found feathers stained brown and curled inward like they'd been soaked and dried in heat. Inside another, a shoe, ivory satin, size 6, wrapped in wax paper with a date written in pencil. But no one could link it to any specific victim. No names matched missing persons. No fibers matched open case records. Walter's work was good, too good, seamless. He didn't just restore furniture. He used it, shaped it, built it around moments no one else was meant to witness. His ledgers read like a graveyard written in upholstery language. Silks, straps, woods, initials, always initials, never names. One note said, screaming in cushion seams, resolved. Another said, breath slows after second stitch. Most of the entries stopped after 2002. The final ledger had only one line. There is nothing left to mend. Beneath that, an empty page. Investigators began cross-referencing wedding venues from that decade, anywhere Walter had worked. They found patterns. Bridesmaids who reported missing veils. Mothers who remembered dresses hung in closets that disappeared before ceremony. None of it was enough. None of it conclusive, until one woman came forward, not with a name, but with a memory. She had bought a couch from a thrift store in 2005. One stayed over, no receipt. Mid-century build, heavy. One arm always squeaked. She said her daughter used to say there was a woman living inside it. Not a ghost, not a story. Just a lady in a white dress who cried quietly when no one else was home. The mother thought it was imagination, bedtime, nerves. until she saw the news about the couch found in Vermont and the photo of Emily's wedding dress. The floral pattern was identical. So was the armrest. She let police take the couch. They scanned the lining. No dress, no blood, but inside the back frame, tucked between layers of old stuffing, a ring. Wedding band, gold, engraved inside with 2 initials, E plus M, Emily and Michael. She had worn it down the aisle, and now it had been recovered 400 miles away. Inside a couch a little girl once said, whispered in the dark. They re-examined the original couch from the thrift store, the one where the photo had been found. This time, they checked the frame itself, not the fabric. Beneath the layers of wood, a small metal hinge was embedded between the beams. Hidden compartment. Locked. Inside it, a box no larger than a deck of cards, sealed shut with wax. Inside that, a photo strip. 4 frames. Emily, hair mussed, eyes wide, not smiling. A man beside her, hand gripping her shoulder. His face was never fully visible, always turned, always just out of reach. But in one frame you could see his fingers, carpenter's hands, deep scars across the knuckles, same scars visible in old photos of Walter Marin. There was no doubt now, Emily hadn't run. She had been taken, and someone, Walter or someone working with him, had documented it, preserved it, hid it inside the very object he knew no one would tear apart. The couch wasn't just disposal, it was confession, sealed beneath thread, offered not to the world, but to the one who might find it later. Maybe guilt, maybe pride, maybe a message meant only for someone else in the loop. Police reviewed the donation records again. The couch had come from a storage unit rented under Walter's name, paid 18 months in advance before his death. The unit was empty except for one thing, an old dress. Form, wire frame, torso only, draped in plastic. The fabric was brittle, but traces of white silk remained pinned in place, like someone had tried to rebuild the shape of a woman who had long since been hidden inside wood and foam. Pinned to the chest of the form was a label, handwritten. She was never meant to leave the room. Not a scream, not a confession, just that. The wedding had continued that night in 1999, long after Emily had disappeared. The guests had danced, the photos had been taken, the cake sliced by someone else's hand, and somewhere, just outside the edges of the music, a man had turned a couch into a tomb and waited 25 years to see if anyone would listen. They traced the couch's journey backward, trying to follow the fabric trail that had hidden a bride for 25 years. The thrift store had logged it as part of a large donation from a rural estate sale held in the outskirts of Bradford County. The house had belonged to Walter Marin, but the sale was handled by a liquidation company unfamiliar with his history. When questioned, the company rep remembered the couch only because of how heavy it was. Said the frame creaked like it was holding secrets. No one had opened it. No one had questioned the floral upholstery or the musty smell sealed in its cushions. It had been loaded with dozens of other items, tables, chairs, 2 dressers, and a clock that never ticked. But the couch was different, tagged with a yellow sticker that read, "Do not list," meaning Walter hadn't intended to sell it. It was stored in a locked room above the garage, wrapped in a tarp. No one knew why, but the lock on that room had been broken when the team arrived. Someone else had already been there. Inside the same room, beneath the tarp, they also found a tool roll, worn leather, stained, filled with industrial needles, upholstery hooks, and one pair of scissors marked with a tape label that said, "Dress only." One blade was dulled, bent, the handle discolored, not from rust, from heat, like it had been pressed too hard for too long. Beside it, a small wooden box, empty. but the inside lid was carved with letters EL, the same initials that appeared in Walter's ledger from June 1999. The couch wasn't a disposal site. It was a vault, a message, maybe even a shrine, and whoever had broken in before the team knew what to look for. Someone who understood that secrets weren't buried anymore. They were upholstered. Across town, a retired waitress named Cora Madden contacted investigators after seeing the news. She had worked the Larson wedding in 1999, remembered the bride as sweet, quiet, a little pale, remembered that a man in overalls had bumped into her in the kitchen hallway around 9:40 p.m. She said he didn't say anything, just kept walking. Tall, quiet, hands like bark. She hadn't thought about it in years, but now she remembered how the bride had been heading toward the staff exit, not toward the reception, not toward her husband, toward a door guests didn't use. Cora said she always wondered why. Later that night, one of the linen carts had gone missing. No one checked it. No one noticed. The ballroom lights dimmed. The playlist looped. The bride was gone. But the linens kept rolling. It took 25 years for that movement to be noticed. Forensic teams returned to the couch and ran deeper imaging of the interior wood. Micro abrasions were found along the lower inner brace. Pressure imprints, the kind that come from weight, specifically knees. Someone had knelt inside the frame. Someone had positioned something. Someone had taken time. Fingerprints were long gone, but embedded in the stuffing was a small glass pearl, the kind sewn onto wedding veils. It matched the veil Emily wore, last seen in pre-wedding photographs. No veil was ever recovered, not in the dress bag, not in her luggage. No one had noticed it was missing, because no one wanted to believe she hadn't left on her own. Back then, stories about runaway brides sold easier than facts. Heartbreak made sense. Abduction didn't. Silence was easier to accept than a body no one could find. But now, the veil had surfaced. Inside the armrest of a couch no one wanted to look at. And when they lifted the upholstery, they found one final detail. An inscription, carved into the frame with the same blade labeled "Dress Only." It said, "Forgiveness is heavier than wood." No initials, no name, but the handwriting matched that of Walter Marin's ledger. Jagged, hesitant, carved too deep, like he needed it to hurt. The investigation shifted, no longer just about Emily. The couch was part of something bigger, a pattern. They searched furniture made by Walter during his early career, long before the 1999 disappearance. His signatures were subtle, not labels, not stamps, but marks. Sometimes a symbol, a stitched circle, sometimes a carved line, always hidden. Investigators called it the seal. They identified 15 confirmed Walter builds containing the seal. Of those, 5 had been sold through private estate sales involving single women who vanished between 1985 and 1985. 2003. None were linked at the time. Different towns, different counties, but all near venues, all around the time of weddings, receptions, banquets. The pattern had been invisible until now. Inside one of those couches, recovered from a farmhouse attic, they found an envelope, sealed, unopened. The paper fused to itself by time. Inside, a photograph, not of a bride, of a man, thin, tall, face obscured by blur, but his hands were clear. And on the back, a single line written in ink. "He taught me to build silence." No date, no context, just that. Walter had an apprentice or a teacher, someone who taught him how to stitch memory into cushions, how to hide the quiet. The couch wasn't his first attempt, it may have been his last. But it was part of a lineage, a method passed like a family trade, and Emily had been its most carefully buried secret, now unstitched, now speaking. The photograph found in the attic couch, the man with blurred features and the line etched on its back, became the pivot point in the widening search, not just for Emily, not just for Walter, but for the method behind them both. Someone had taught him how to build silence, and now investigators were forced to look further back, before the year 1999, before Emily vanished, before Walter was a name anyone remembered. Public records showed he had apprenticed briefly in the early 80s under a reclusive craftsman named Victor Harland, known locally for restoring antique church pews and confessionals, mostly working in old parish buildings along rural New England routes. Harland disappeared in 1984. No funeral, no obituary, just stopped showing up for jobs. Some said he retired and moved south. Others said he died quietly, with no one left to claim him. But a single receipt from his workshop remained in a folded manila folder found in Walter's garage, stained with grease and sawdust. Dated October 1983, it described a custom furniture job labeled "Containment Triple Stitch Seams, Rosewood Frame for Traveling Exhibit." The customer was anonymous. Payment was made in cash. The item delivered was a storage bench, never recovered. Investigators searched parish records for any mention of the bench or Harland's final clients. Nothing. The trail was designed to vanish. But in one church basement, beneath rusted filing cabinets and water-damaged hymnals, they found a blueprint tucked behind a broken clock. It showed measurements for something labeled "Penitent Chamber," signed with Harland's initials and scrawled beside it in smaller handwriting. "Replace confession with compression." The phrase meant nothing at first. Then they noticed the framing. Wood lengths listed in centimeters, not inches, even though all of Harland's work had been in imperial units. The only part written in inches was a hollow panel marked beneath the seat. An inner cavity less than 8 inches high, lined with felt and labeled "breath track." It was the only annotation in red pencil. They matched the measurements to one of Harland's remaining works, a prayer bench still used in a rural chapel outside Coleridge Township. When examined with ground-penetrating radar, the bench tested hollow. The church resisted removal, citing heritage status, but inside, X-ray imaging showed a second lining tucked between the structure. No bones, no remains, but pinned in place was a lock of hair, wrapped in gauze and bound with a rusted safety pin. Attached was a note, almost illegible. "She was silent before I began." The handwriting didn't match Harland, it matched Walter, meaning he had revisited his mentor's pieces, maybe restored them, maybe used them, maybe studied them to understand how the frame could speak when the voice could not. The couch was never just a couch. It was part of a system. A lineage passed quietly between craftsmen who weren't just building furniture. They were building forgetting machines. No chains, no violence, just rooms inside objects, compartments inside beauty, layers that muted the screams and absorbed the weight of grief until no one thought to look inside the things that made homes feel warm. And they never operated loudly, always near weddings, near transition points, moments where people change their names, change their clothes, change their lives. Perfect timing for a disappearance. Easy to blame emotion. Cold feet, last-minute nerves. Meanwhile, the quiet hands went unnoticed, carrying a veil behind a service hallway, rolling linen carts toward delivery docks, sewing silk into seams no one would ever think to tear. They built memory the way cathedrals built echo, by accident, through repetition, and sometimes they left marks. Sometimes the seal was forgotten. One chair recovered from a community center contained a dried bouquet pressed flat inside its cushion lining. The petals were still pale pink, crushed between two Bible verses printed on aged paper. Investigators traced it back to a woman who had vanished after her engagement party in 1994. Case was closed at the time, cold feet, now reopened, and she wasn't the only one. 6 cases from 1986 to 2002 matched the same criteria. Women who disappeared within 48 hours of major ceremonies, always within range of a venue Walter or his predecessor had worked. None were ever recovered. All considered personal disappearances, emotional breaks, now reframed as something else, a system of silence, a pattern of stitching, and all of it pointing to a phrase found again and again in handwritten notes recovered from both couch and attic: forgiveness sown. No one knew what it meant. Some believed it was a signature, others a plea, but deeper handwriting analysis suggested something else. It wasn't a confession, it was a process. The couch was never about murder, not entirely. It was about control, containment, turning a person into fabric, a life into weight, a soul into something that could be sewn down and sat upon and passed down without anyone knowing what had been lost inside. And that meant Emily's case wasn't unique. It was simply the one they hadn't sealed fast enough, the one whose thread came loose. And with it, the whole system began to unravel. The phrase "forgiveness sown" became the thread investigators couldn't shake, not just because it kept reappearing in the artifacts Walter left behind, but because it suggested something deliberate, like a vow or a ritual, not a mistake. People don't sew forgiveness into wood unless they believe what they're building matters more than what they're taking apart. Forensic teams returned to Walter's personal property, this time searching not just for items linked to Emily, but for any trace of others who might have passed through the same pattern. Hidden behind insulation in the attic crawlspace was a narrow file box sealed with a leather strap and wrapped in linen strips, each strip marked in ink with a single letter. When unwound, the linen formed words, short messages written like confessions. One said, "I tried to speak." Another said, "I wore her name." One strip simply read, "Too late to untie." Inside the box were 10 index cards, each yellowed with age, and each tucked into its own sleeve. On the front of each card, a date. On the back, a fabric swatch: lace, satin, denim, cotton, always white, always hand-stitched around the edge. Some were torn, some scorched. One had faint red staining at the bottom corner. Lab tests later confirmed it to be human blood. Only one card had any handwriting. It read 1989. Margot, still humming. Investigators searched for any local or state missing person named Margot from that year. One result surfaced. Margot Wexley, 22, vanished the night before her wedding. Location: small inn 30 miles from where Walter lived at the time. Case closed as voluntary disappearance after she was seen by a gas station attendant buying a bus ticket the same night. But the surveillance footage was never saved. No ticket was confirmed. No luggage was recovered. And now, her name had appeared in a dead man's attic, stitched to fabric that had no business being preserved. The humming reference tied back to another report. A child in a foster home who once described hearing music coming from inside a couch when she pressed her ear against it. No one believed her. She was 5. Now the couch was gone, sold 3 houses ago. But the memory returned when her caseworker saw the news. And just like that, another couch went missing into the ledger of silence. It became clear that Walter hadn't just built one grave. He had built a network of them. Soft walls, quiet places, places designed to hold someone until their name disappeared, until their photo faded, until the memory of them existed only in fiber and scent, and the pressure of a body that no longer moved, and always near moments of transformation, always near events that marked a before and after, because that was the easiest way to hide someone when people expected them to change anyway. The couch from Emily's case was re-examined for structural patterns. Beneath the silk, beneath the frame, they found a secondary layer, not insulation, not support, a pocket sewn directly into the body of the couch, and inside that pocket, a cassette tape, unmarked, degraded, but still intact enough to extract audio. What they heard was not music, not speech, just the soft sound of breathing. For 37 minutes. No background noise, no struggle, just slow, steady breath. Female, young, measured. And at minute 36, the breath caught, paused, and a voice whispered something barely audible. It said, "Are you there?" Not a scream, not a plea, just that investigators believed it was Emily. The breathing matched her lung capacity and vocal profile. The tape had been hidden, not discarded. Someone wanted it found, but only when it was too late to intervene, like a secret saved for the moment guilt no longer needed to be carried. And it explained the phrase again. Forgiveness sown. Walter didn't just silence the people he took, he archived them, not to forget, but to remember on his own terms. He built reliquaries, not tombs. And inside each one, some thread of the person remained. A lock of hair, a photo, a tape, a ring, a dress, not out of sentiment, out of structure, as if he believed the only way to make the act whole was to stitch it closed with memory tucked inside, not removed, not erased, just absorbed. Like each person became part of the couch, not metaphorically, physically, materially. And this raised a deeper question. What was he preserving them from? No sign of assault, no ransom demands, no evidence of rage or frenzy, only process, only intention. Some wondered if he saw the women as contaminated by change, about to become wives, mothers, someone else, and wanted to keep them as they were, untouched, unfinished, caught between steps. The silence of in between, like a photograph never developed, like a name never spoken aloud again. And the most chilling realization wasn't that he had built all this alone, it was that someone had taught him how. The question of who taught Walter became the thread investigators couldn't cut without unraveling the entire fabric of the case. Walter hadn't invented the method, he had inherited it, shaped it, passed it forward through seams and silence. The photograph found earlier, the one with the man's blurred face and the message he taught me to build silence, was re-examined using new contrast layers and light analysis. Behind the man, barely visible in the dark smear of background, was a workshop wall, not Walter's. The tool arrangement was different. Wider bench, older models. One of the tools hanging beside the bench had a serial number still legible in the image. It matched a discontinued upholstery hook manufactured in 1975. Sold to fewer than 50 buyers in 1975, the Northeast region. One buyer stood out, Victor Harland, listed as a traveling restoration specialist, operated under his own business name, Penitent Works, the same man Walter briefly apprenticed under in the early 1980s, the same man who vanished without record in 1984. Investigators began digging deeper into Harlan's business history. No tax filings, no employees, just a string of work orders, handwritten, mailed from towns that no longer existed, merged or erased by time and highway expansion. One invoice described a private commission for a prayer bench reinforced with stillness. Another mentioned structural concealment. None of the jobs had contact numbers, just mailing addresses that returned no response. But one return envelope was found inside a postal bin preserved in an abandoned post office being converted to storage. It was never delivered. The address written in soft blue ink, 44 Hemlock, Crone Township, a town that had been absorbed by a reservoir project in 1985. Underwater now, gone. They cross-referenced the names on the original Penitent Works files with missing persons reports. The most chilling connection came from a woman named Marianne Devane, listed as a part-time assistant to Harland in 1982. Her name appeared on 2 of his receipts as a co-signer. She disappeared the following spring. The only record left was a hand-scrawled note sent to her sister that read, "I'll be off the road for a while, learning how to stay very still." Her sister believed it meant rehab. She was never seen again. That phrase, "learning how to stay very still," was repeated almost exactly in one of Walter's notes found inside the inner lining of a vintage love seat. The note read, "I taught her how not to move, but she already knew." Same sentence, different era, passed down like a mantra. And that's what Eden Protocol investigators would later call it, an inheritance of stillness. Not a cult, not a conspiracy, just a quiet skill passed between isolated men who learned to turn objects into tombs and breath into thread. Forensic searches uncovered a second tape inside a chest recovered from a cottage once rented by Harland. The tape contained ambient sound, water, wind, something faint clicking every few seconds. Then, at the 34-minute mark, a phrase whispered, "Some people are made to sit, others are made to be sat upon." And then silence, voice analysis inconclusive. But the cadence resembled Walter's early audio logs, meaning he had either recorded it or been in the room when it was spoken. More disturbing was the way the voice shifted just before the end. The breath stilled, not in fear, not in pain, but like someone reaching the end of a thought or a lesson, like punctuation. After that, nothing. The cottage had been untouched for decades, the chest hidden under floorboards, the room filled with dust and chipped paint. But on one windowsill, carved in faint lettering, "Margot sat here," the same name as one of Walter's index cards, meaning Harland had known her or had passed her to Walter. The line between builder and successor began to blur. One didn't finish what the other started. They overlapped. A system not of murder, but of arrangement, of selection, of preservation. Victims weren't buried. They were placed, stored, displayed, and then forgotten by everyone except the one who made them silent. And silence became its own object, its own weight, its own type of permanence. The investigation pivoted to institutions that had cataloged antique furniture repairs between 1970 and 1995 in one, a university preservation lab. An assistant remembered a visitor who came often, always alone, never speaking, bringing in fabric with no explanation. He paid in cash, never returned anything. He dropped off, just watched, then left. She remembered his hands most of all. Long fingers, slow movements. He once showed her how to bind threads without a knot, just pressure and tuck. Said it made the weight more honest. She never got his name, but when shown a restored image of Harland's face, her reaction was instant. She said he looked the same, but older, like a man who forgot how to move quickly. Another link, another pair of hands carrying the same method, passed from Harland to Walter, from Walter to fabric, from fabric to couch, from couch to the person who would one day sit and never know what had been sealed beneath them. And in one recovered envelope, folded into fourths and tucked between the pages of a ledger with no dates, a final message was written in smudged graphite. No salutation, no signature, just 4 words. The breath is folded, not lost, not gone, folded, like fabric, like memory, like something you press between pages and forget until someone opens the book. And Emily had been folded for 25 years, until someone finally sat the wrong way and the seam split. The phrase, "the breath is folded," shifted the tone of the investigation from murder to memorial, not in the legal sense, but in the psychological architecture of what was being uncovered. The couch was never meant to dispose. It was meant to hold, and every item recovered, each pearl, each ribbon, each whispered tape, pointed towards something worse than death. A kind of living burial preserved by obsession and disguised as craft investigators mapped the locations where Walter and Harland had worked and lived, placing pins, not just for missing persons, but for recorded upholstery contracts, fabric orders, and antique restorations. The pattern curved like a radius, always circling moments of transformation: weddings, baptisms, graduations, and funerals. Moments when families were too distracted, too full of ceremony and expectation to notice the quiet person at the edge of the room measuring a bench, refitting a cushion, walking a cart through the back hallway. The couch was only one example. In a guest chair stored in an antique shop's back room, they found another remnant: 4 pressed lilies wrapped in parchment paper, bound with dental floss. The flowers were coated in resin. Embedded in the resin, a fingernail. Beneath the chair, scratched into the wood, the words, "I said yes, but I never left." The handwriting didn't match Walter or Harland. It was someone else, a third person. Handwriting analysts determined it came from a woman's hand, likely written in distress, likely in haste. If she wrote it, she had time to crawl beneath the chair before being silenced, or she had already been placed there and left a final thought before the breath folded. One of the analysts pointed out the phrasing followed the pattern, a duality of agreement and disappearance. She had accepted the ceremony but had never passed through it. Taken at the edge, caught between the aisle and the silence, and that was the ritual. Never at the start, never at the end. Always at the hinge, always in the threshold. The forensic team assigned to the couch noted something previously missed. The silk sewn into its lining had not come from Emily's original dress, but a replica, close enough to fool the eye, but not the weave. The fibers had been dyed slightly darker, traced back to a discontinued line of ceremonial fabrics only sold for 6 months in 1999. This raised a new theory that Walter had kept the original dress elsewhere, preserved it, not as a trophy, but as part of the process. Days later, that theory was confirmed. Inside a locked chest found in a storm cellar beneath the carpenter's house, they found the original dress, still intact, still pristine, wrapped in museum-grade acid-free paper, not crumpled, not torn, displayed like relic. Beside it, a notebook spiral-bound, filled with sketches, not of victims, of furniture. Every page detailed a chair or couch or bench, but with one strange consistency. Each drawing included human silhouettes drawn inside the structure as though part of the internal design. Some were curled, some folded in half, some tucked beneath seats. One, in particular, showed a woman lying flat beneath the springs of a fainting couch, her arms outstretched, one eye open. Above that sketch, the words, "Placed, but not passed." This was not about disposal. This was about curation. Whoever began this, Harland or someone before him, believed in the idea of held memory, that a person at the moment of transformation could be suspended, sewn into the exact version of themselves they were meant to be, never aged, never ruined, never lost, just trapped in fabric, smell, pressure, and silence. And once you understood that, the phrase "forgiveness sewn" became less about redemption and more about possession. Forgiveness was the act of capture, the stitching was the ritual. And the couch became an altar, not to grief, to control. Not long after, investigators found a photograph taped to the underside of a bookshelf Walter had built for a local library in 1997. The photo was of a hallway. At first glance, nothing unusual. Just wallpaper, carpet, a hallway sconce, but in the lower left corner was the corner of a wedding dress, just the hem, just the shadow of a shoe. The label on the back said, "Found her on the way." This photo was dated a full year before Emily disappeared, which meant there were more, ones they hadn't found, ones whose names were never even written in the ledgers. Another photo surfaced weeks later, mailed anonymously to the Cold Case Division. No return address. The envelope contained a single black and white image of a couch, untouched, displayed in what looked like a private gallery. The couch matched one of Walter's earliest pieces, a build thought to have been lost in a fire. In the image, a shadow stands behind the couch. Tall, narrow, blurred, but not alone. Reflected in the glass frame of a painting on the wall behind it was another figure, a woman, sitting upright, hands on her knees, eyes wide open, not blinking. Her reflection perfect, but her presence absent from the actual couch, meaning she had been inside, sealed, and her imprint had survived through the mirror. The case shifted again, not just about the ones taken, but about the rooms they never left. Not just furniture, but portals, memory sealed into reflection. Every couch was a doorway, and every stitch was a lock. And whoever had been folding the breath knew that someday someone would sit too hard and it would all come undone. The mirrors became the next focus, not for vanity, but for memory. Every major recovery site tied to Walter or Harland contained at least one mirror positioned near or opposite the placement furniture, always angled, always functional, never broken. It wasn't just coincidence. It was part of the arrangement. And once the investigators began cataloging the orientation of mirrors at each scene, a new pattern emerged. Each one reflected a portion of the object where a person had once been placed, even if the placement was no longer visible. Some showed the curve of an armrest, some captured a side panel, some, when reconstructed using light mapping software, formed near-perfect reflections of the couch interiors where victims were later discovered, meaning the mirrors weren't decorative. They were intentional, part of the ritual, part of the process, not to reflect beauty, to reflect containment like the breath that had been folded needed to be witnessed, if not directly, then sideways, as shadow, as echo, as proof. One recovered photo taken in 1990, years before Emily's case, showed a bride seated on a love seat in a bridal suite, her hands folded, her face partially turned. But in the mirror behind her, the reflection showed her eyes wide open, looking straight at the glass, lips parted as if mid-sentence. The original print was found in a box of donations never meant for public circulation. The bride, according to hotel records, had disappeared 3 hours later. Her name was Julia. She was never seen again, and the love seat she had been photographed on was traced back to Walter's ledger under the entry, "Jail, silk, mirror safe." The same love seat was never recovered. Assumed discarded during renovations, but the mirror still existed, part of a private collection in a gallery 2 states away. And when scanned, the backing of the frame had a message scratched into the silver. "I am still seated," not written, scratched, with a thin blade, shallow, uneven, meaning someone had touched the inside of the mirror's frame, meaning someone had placed the message not to be seen immediately, but to be found later when everything else was gone. This changed the direction of the investigation entirely. The mirrors weren't just reflections of past victims. They were messages, records, burial markers for the breath that had been folded. And once one message was found, others followed. In a mirror recovered from an estate in Pine Hollow, the glass showed faint smudges when viewed under oblique lighting. Forensic powder revealed the prints formed 5 words, written in the oil of a single fingertip. "He never let me stand." And beneath that, etched into the frame, a serial number that matched an early Harland piece, built in 1978, sold to a retired pastor who had lived alone and died without a will. The mirror had been passed through 4 owners. No one had noticed the marks. Not until the light hit just right. Not until someone remembered to look at the furniture the way the builder did. Not as comfort, but as scripture. Every piece had rules. Every reflection had meaning. And each one pointed back to the idea that those who were taken were never meant to disappear entirely. They were meant to be paused, preserved, studied, like museum relics of human transformation interrupted mid-ritual. No death certificate, no burial, just compression and reflection and silence. The couch was only the softest example. There were harder ones. In a glass cabinet recovered from a closed-down inn, a locked drawer had a mirror mounted to its ceiling panel, positioned directly over a velvet-lined drawer that tested positive for dried blood. Not enough to indicate violence, just enough to suggest presence. And the mirror above it had one word scrawled into the condensation residue built up from years of humid summers. One word, over and over again: wait, 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 wait. Sometimes layered atop itself, sometimes spaced out. No initials, no date, just a loop, like the breath itself had been trying to leave one last imprint before the drawer closed for good. Investigators began to theorize that the mirrors weren't just witnesses, they were the mechanism. The silence wasn't complete without being seen, or at least reflected. The builder, whether Harland or Walter or someone else who had passed the method downward, had embedded meaning into angles and surfaces most people ignored. The couch didn't just hold the body. The mirror held the memory. The house held the hush. And the silence held everything else. And this is what made the case so difficult to close. Because even when a piece of furniture was recovered, even when blood or fabric was traced, the person it held was often gone. Long gone. Not just in body, but in story. No family waiting. No one searching. Only the reflection remained. And so the investigators kept searching for the reflections in junk shops, in basements, in thrift stores where furniture leaned against cracked walls like artifacts waiting to be translated. And in one, beneath a covered dresser with a 3-pane mirror, they found a photograph pinned to the back panel. A bride, mid-twirl, hair loose, eyes laughing. But in the far right mirror pane, her face was still unmoving. Expression blank, like it had stopped moving a second before the rest of her had. And at the bottom of the mirror, a message barely visible. Don't leave me in the glass. Not a threat, not a plea, a request. Quiet, polite, desperate, and beneath it, etched deeper. He only sees me when I'm still. The couch was never the whole story. It was the softest chapter. The real story was in the reflections, where the stillness lived long after the breath had folded. The question no one could answer wasn't where Emily had gone or how the silk had been sewn, but why the silence had to be folded in furniture and sealed behind mirrors and left to breathe in the dark for years, while everyone else moved on, as if nothing had ever creaked beneath the weight of what they sat on and stared into and passed down from attic to thrift, to home again and again, without noticing that each chair had once whispered or each mirror had once remembered. And the deeper investigators went into the legacy of placement, the more they began to see that it was never about hiding. It was about holding people in moments, holding names in stillness, holding breath in fabric, holding memory in posture. Everything the builders did was rooted in interruption, not erasure. And that made what they found next all the more devastating, because it wasn't an object and it wasn't a photograph. It was a person, a woman found living in assisted care under a false name, with no known family listed in the system as Margaret H., last seen in 2001 when she had reportedly checked herself into a hospital claiming she had memory gaps and recurring dreams of being sewn shut. She had scars on her arms, inconsistent with surgery, and spoke slowly as if afraid the wrong word would reset something she didn't understand. The staff believed she had been through trauma, but no one ever connected her to any missing persons case. She had no prints on file, no social security record before 2001, no verifiable history until now. Her story was ignored until one nurse watching the recent coverage of the Couch investigation recognized the symbols found stitched beneath the upholstery and matched them to drawings Margaret had made in her journal dozens of times, circular loops, intersecting lines not decorative but diagrammatic like instructions drawn from memory but meant for hands that no longer trusted themselves. Investigators were brought in. They spoke to her gently, asked her about the drawings, and she said she didn't remember making them, but she always felt calmer when she drew the curves. When asked if she remembered the name Margot, her eyes widened, not in recognition, but in reflex, as if a door had opened behind her that she didn't want to see through, and she said quietly, "I don't like being remembered." She didn't speak much after that, but in her room they found a box beneath her bed filled with small objects, ribbon lace, a corner of a photo torn. So only the background remained a mirror shard taped to cardboard with words etched around the border in black pen. "They only see me when I'm gone." Handwriting matched the script found in several of Walter's pieces, but shakier, as if written with a recovering hand or one still learning to hold pens again. Fingerprints were partial damaged by time, but forensic reconstruction placed Margaret H. within high probability of being Margot Wexley, missing since 1989, declared a runaway, declared forgotten, now reclassified as recovered. But what she had survived and what she remembered were two separate things, because memory had been folded too deeply inside her. And the things she drew weren't just symbols. They were maps, guides to the arrangement, drawings of how her body had been bent, placed, folded, fitted into frame, then lifted back out, and somewhere in those years between vanishing and resurfacing, she had escaped. But no one knew how, not even her. All she could say when asked what happened was the mirror opened. She never clarified what that meant, but her drawing suggested a pattern of compression and release, like she had found a fault in the system, a seam that hadn't held a breath that had remained too long and pushed back, and that terrified investigators more than anything else, because it meant the system had weaknesses, but it also meant that someone inside it had lived long enough to become part of it, to learn its shapes and turn them into something new. A survivor who wasn't supposed to speak, now drawing messages into spiral notebooks for no one in particular, and maybe for everyone, and her presence validated what many feared, that there were others, not just forgotten, not just dead, but alive and reshaped, and somewhere else. Margaret had no family left to claim her, but she had a voice, now recorded, documented, protected, and though her memory never fully returned, her patterns were studied, her movements tracked her past, reconstructed from fragments, and she became the first known echo to speak, not clearly, but enough to break the stillness, enough to confirm that what Walter and Harlan built didn't end with their deaths. It continued in the silence left behind in the spaces. No one had looked in the furniture. No one had asked questions about in the corners where breath was taught to fold and memory was trained to sit, and Margaret had been. sat for too long, and now, even if her words were partial, her existence was proof the couch was never empty, and the mirror never clean, and the silence never sealed all the way shut. The discovery of Margot, didn't close the case. It fractured it open wider because now investigators weren't chasing a killer, they were chasing a blueprint, not of murder, but of preservation, a ritual that had embedded itself into homes, heirlooms, forgotten corners of inheritance where couches sat undisturbed for years, not because they were cherished, but because they were heavy. Too heavy to move, too heavy to lift, and that weight had always been explained away as craftsmanship, when in truth it was silence lined with memory, wrapped in thread, disguised as upholstery. And Margot had escaped, but she hadn't been the only one. The patterns in her drawings were matched against the furniture schematics pulled from Walter and Harlan's ledgers, and one by one the diagrams began to align corners matched to limb placements, panel joins to shoulder gaps, hinge depths to spinal curvature, and it became clear that the victims weren't only stored, they were measured, shaped, arranged like objects of display, not mutilated, not dismembered, but softened, silenced, compacted into stillness like breath taxidermied, and not all had died right away. Margot's timeline suggested she had remained sealed for weeks, maybe longer. Her survival owed to the thin break in the mirror frame that had let in just enough air, just enough sound, just enough of something to keep her mind turning even when her body was told to stop, and that mirror, the one she described in her sketchbooks, was never recovered, but her descriptions were specific: beveled edge wooden frame, water warping near the bottom, and a chip shaped like a bird near the top left corner, and that was enough to identify a matching piece in a regional antique gallery 2 hours away, listed in the catalog as Country Pastoral Mirror, sold by a private collector in 2003. When investigators arrived, they found the mirror on display beneath a spotlight. Its surface polished, its frame cleaned, but beneath the backing plate carved into the support wood were initials: MFW Margot, Francine Wexley. Her full name never printed publicly, never known to the press, etched into a mirror sold and resold and admired for its frame, while her breath had been hidden inside its reflection. And that became the most horrifying part. Not the act, but the display. The way these pieces had been admired, auctioned, complimented, passed down as antiques, when in reality they were grave markers, hollow reliquaries for the living and the forgotten. And in one warehouse, outside town, where unsold inventory from estate sales had been kept in climate-controlled units, investigators found 3 more mirrors matching the builder's seal, all facing inward, all stacked like pages in a book. And, behind the third one taped to the wooden crate, a photo. A woman seated on a fainting couch, same fabric, same style, same pale silk trailing beneath her feet. But her face had been scratched out. Not by time, not by damage. Deliberately, someone had taken a blade to the photo, carved through her eyes, her mouth, her edges, until she was only outline, only posture, only pose. And on the back, in the same thin handwriting found in Walter's early sketches, the words "she asked to be remembered" written over top of an older note, faint and nearly erased, that said, "We do not record what moves," and the contradiction between those two phrases struck investigators hard because it meant someone inside the ritual had broken the rule, had wanted the silence to be known, had asked to be remembered, and whoever scratched her face had punished her for it, not by destroying the photo, but by turning her into shape without identity, stillness, without story. Another seated form in a house filled with furniture that hummed when no one was watching, and that couch, the one in the photo, was later found in the basement of a funeral home that had gone bankrupt in 2006, left behind in the staging room, its cushions worn but intact, and when they lifted the lining, they found another dress fragment, same silk, same stitching, same faint trace of rosewater perfume that had been cataloged in Emily's case. A smell that shouldn't have survived decades but had been sealed inside, perfectly folded, and beneath that pressed into the underside of the couch frame. Another name, Lori Benton, missing since 1996. Her case ruled a disappearance tied to post-wedding anxiety, but now reopened, now reclassified, now another breath found folded in the dark, and her story was never told, her name never called again, until someone sat too deep on a couch that had no business being this heavy and wondered why it creaked in silence. And now she too was speaking not in voice, but in thread, in pressure, in the ache that comes from being placed and never moved again. The discovery of Lori Benton's name pressed beneath the fainting couch reframed everything that came before, not just as tragedy, but as method. And method is more terrifying than madness because it means someone wasn't acting on impulse or rage, but on intention and repetition and faith in a process that could only be called design. And when they laid out the names, Margot, Emily, Julia, Lori, and the unnamed reflections seen only through warped glass and faded photos, the pattern wasn't linear, it was architectural. Every victim wasn't just a person lost, but a piece of structure, part of a larger silent house built from absence and upholstery and stillness. And when investigators returned to Walter Marin's ledgers and blueprints, they realized that none of the furniture was designed in isolation. Each couch, each chair, each mirror was part of a larger spatial concept rooms that had never existed in full, but were imagined across decades, scattered like broken cathedrals. A mirror here, a bench there, a couch buried beneath years of use, but each one aligned by ratio and reflection, and when plotted onto a single map using locations tied to recovered pieces, the design formed a shape too intentional to ignore a rough circle broken at one edge, as if something had been left unfinished, and that edge pointed toward a town called Stonefield, a place no longer marked on modern maps, swallowed by highway expansion in the early 2000s, but visible in archived satellite imagery, a cluster of structures surrounded by pine and quiet roads, and in one corner of the grid, a building still intact. Roof partially collapsed, windows shattered, but shape unmistakable. It had once been a furniture showroom closed in 1994, 2 years before Lori Benton disappeared. It was listed under a shell corporation, dissolved with no forwarding address, but the building had never been demolished, simply locked, boarded, and forgotten, like everything else in this story. And when investigators gained access, they expected dust and rot and empty floors. What they found instead was silence and arrangement. The front showroom was stripped bare except for 6 pieces of furniture. 1 couch, 3 chairs, a sideboard, and a mirror, each facing inward toward a central point where a spotlight still hung from the ceiling. The power long cut, but the bulb intact, and in the dust at the center of the floor, faint outlines of footprints, not recent, but preserved beneath a layer of soot, like someone had stood there for a very long time and then left all at once. And when they lifted the cushions of the couch, they found fabric, not silk this time, but cotton white, heavy, monogrammed, with a name sewn so tightly the thread had embedded into the weave. The name was Cassia. No known missing persons, no records, no wedding announcements, no obituary. And yet the stitching matched Walter's style, and the handwriting on a slip of paper tucked into the seam read, "She walked into the frame, not out," meaning this Cassia, whoever she was, hadn't been taken. She had stepped in willingly, or at least without resistance, and beneath the paper, another item, a key. Small, rusted, unmarked, but tagged with a folded scrap of photo paper, showing a mirror cracked down the center and a message written in faint pencil. The breath still moves. If you sit long enough, this wasn't a grave. This was a chapel built not for worship, but for waiting. And that idea sent investigators spiraling, because it suggested that someone was still alive, or believed to be still alive, somewhere in the network, and that this entire structure had been made not just to preserve memory, or silence, or shape, but to keep something breathing, unseen, unspoken, unmoved. And when they scanned the building for heat, or life, or hidden chambers, they found none. But in the far back office beneath a false drawer panel, a ledger remained open on a final page with only one sentence written across the center. If they sit long enough, they will understand the silence, and the key found beside the name. Cassia did not fit any door in the showroom, but it did match a lock uncovered weeks later in an off-site storage unit registered under a name never publicly tied to Walter, a name only found in a single undated invoice, signed Victor Harland. The unit was small, windowless, unremarkable, but inside was a chair covered in a cloth sheet, and on the sheet pinned with a dressmaker's pin, a note written in thread. Not ink, not pen, but red thread stitched directly into the fabric, and the note read, "Place her properly or not at all." And beneath the cloth, the chair was unlike any recovered before, not heavy, not antique, not elaborate, but simple, elegant, and beneath the seat a hollow frame large enough to fit a human body, not bent, not folded, not hidden, but whole. And the chamber was empty, no remains, no photos, no artifacts, just dust. And something else, air moving faintly from a crack in the baseboard, meaning the chamber had once been sealed but was now open. And this was the question that silenced the room. Who had left, and how long had they been waiting to be seen, and how many others were still seated, still stitched, still folded inside silence, waiting for someone to finally sit and listen. The chamber in the chair was empty, but it had not always been, and the dust inside told a story more truthful than any confession, because it held the exact shape of a body that had once been still for too long, then vanished like breath, released too late, and the crack in the baseboard meant there had been movement, recent or old. It didn't matter, because the silence had been broken, and something had stepped out of it, and Cassia, whoever she was, had left no remains. Only outline, only intent, and the name kept appearing, not in files or police records, but in the recovered fragments that had been overlooked before on a slip of paper tucked inside the seam of a mirror frame from 1987. The words Cassia said, "We could remember just once," and then folded away and in a ribbon looped around a furniture handle buried beneath estate junk. The phrase Cassia waited for the breath to return, and in one of the earliest ledgers from Harland himself, the name written once in tiny letters at the margin beside the note mirror, placed east-facing, not for reflection, but for recall. Cassia observes, meaning she had been there from the start, or before the start, and no one knew if Cassia was a victim, a builder, a witness, or something else. But what was known now was that she had learned the method. She had sat in silence. She had folded herself into it, and then she had unfolded, and that changed everything, because it meant the breath could return. The silence could be broken not by force, not by violence, but by waiting long enough for memory to push back, and that had been the entire ritual all along. Containment, not destruction. Stillness, not death arrangement, not chaos. And Cassia had made it through, not as an escape, but as a re-entry, a return. And that's when the final mirror was found in a closed-down chapel 5 miles outside of Stonefield, covered in plastic, forgotten beneath scaffolding. It had once hung behind the altar, now resting against the wall, and behind the mirror, etched into the wood, an entire paragraph of stitched language thread pulled through soft pine like someone had sewn directly into the surface. Not a message for the world, but a record for the ones who knew, and it read, "We were never taken. We were chosen to hold the weight, to remain unmoved so they could keep dancing, to carry the breath while they forgot it, to watch the frames so they could be filled. Later, we didn't ask to be seated, but once placed, we held on, and the silence wasn't the punishment. It was the shelter, and we stayed. Not because we were told to, but because no one asked us to leave." And the name signed beneath it, in needlepoint Cassia. No last name, no date, and the mirror tested positive for human oil, skin residue, sweat breath contact along the edges, Recent, not decades old, recent enough that someone had placed their face close to the glass and waited long enough to leave a trace, and when scanned under thermal light, faint heat signatures were still visible like fingerprints half cooled, and then it was clear Cassia had been there not just decades ago, but days ago, and that meant one of two things. Either she had returned or she had never fully left, and across town in a different thrift store, a mirror was being purchased by a woman redecorating her home. Simple frame, soft glass, no story attached, just an object. And when she placed it in her hallway and walked by it the next morning, her daughter asked who the lady in the chair behind her was. The woman turned and saw nothing, and the child said she was nice, not scary. She just looked tired and then said something else, something that froze the woman in place. The girl said she was whispering my name, but it wasn't the one you gave me, and that's when the mirror was taken back, not by force, but by silence. The thrift store said they didn't remember receiving it. It wasn't on the books. It had just shown up, leaned against the back wall with no tag, and when authorities arrived, it was gone again, because the objects were never the point. They were the threshold, and Cassia was already moving again. Not in malice, not in rage, just watching, sitting, remembering, carrying what the world kept trying to forget. And somewhere beyond the frame, someone else was sitting now. Someone who would one day unfold too, because the silence was never perfect and breath never truly stops. It only slows until the next name is spoken and the next mirror reflects what had been buried under cushions and stitched into corners and sewn into couches, mistaken for comfort but made to contain. It didn't end with Cassia, and maybe it never would, because what had been stitched into the world wasn't just silence, but pattern, and patterns repeat, not because they are remembered, but because they are left undisturbed long enough to start again. And the story of the couch, the bride, the vanished weight beneath the floral upholstery was only the thread someone finally tugged after decades of ignoring the creak in the frame or the breath that lingered when no one else was speaking. And when the couch was dismantled, placed into evidence, scanned, cataloged, and archived, it became the first real record, not of a crime, but of a structure, a design passed from builder to apprentice, from victim to vessel, from silence to mirror. And the name Emily Larson was no longer a myth, a bride who ran or froze or changed her mind, but a witness to something the world had never had language for before, a system not built on hate or impulse, but arrangement and the preservation of transformation, suspended forever in soft shapes and thread and wood and breath. And when investigators closed the physical file, they opened a broader one, because now every missing woman whose last known location aligned with a venue or a showroom or a delivery date was no longer cold. They were part of the warmth beneath the cushions, the weight inside the frame, the silence that remained too constant and too specific to be chance. And Margot was no longer missing, but remembered in mirror scratchings and trembling lines of red thread. Cassia was no longer a rumor, but a shape that returned again and again to remind the world it had looked away too long, and the furniture was no longer decor. It was archive, and every piece still unexamined out in the world, waiting in forgotten homes or storage units or antique stores, was not waiting for sale. It was waiting for understanding, for someone to sit, not just with curiosity, but with grief and patience, and the readiness to hear what had always been breathing quietly just below the surface. And the final image, burned into the minds of those who followed the case, wasn't the couch or the dress or the names etched in wood. It was a photo recovered from a half-destroyed film roll in a camera found beneath floorboards in the original showroom, long ruined by weather and dust. But one frame remained legible. A photo of a room filled with chairs, all empty, facing the same direction toward a single mirror standing upright in the center, and in the mirror, not a reflection but a figure seated facing outward, unmoving, and no one who saw the photo could say for certain whether the figure had been truly there or whether she had been folded into the breath of the house so thoroughly that the mirror had simply decided to remember her anyway, because that was what the mirrors did. They remembered what the world did not. They bore witness when no one else stayed, and in every place Cassia passed through, something remained, not loud, not visible, not named, but aligned. And to this day, the furniture still surfaces, couch by couch, chair by chair, thread by thread, and in the quietest corners of thrift stores and estate sales, there are still people who say they sat down and felt the pressure shift, not beneath them, but inside them, as if someone was still watching, not to haunt, but to hold, and the breath had only been folded, never lost.